Good afternoon, Monday. It is Monday, which means welcome to another episode of RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's episode, we're going to take you back to high school physics class to talk all about running technique. So take out your physics book. If you saved your physics book from high school, take it out because we're going to review a lot of concepts that we all learned in high school. Running technique gets a lot of commotion, which is quite interesting to me because running is the basis for all human movement. It is something that we evolved to do. And yet, if you look around on social media, and other articles on the internet and stuff, there's a lot of commotion about how runners should run, even though it's this very natural movement. We all inherently know how to run. Nobody ever had to teach us how to run when we were little kids. We went from a crawl to a walk to a run without anybody ever having to teach us how to do it. Unlike swimming or riding a bicycle, those are things you had to learn how to do because we're not amphibians. We don't know how to swim. Swimming is not a natural activity. We have to learn how to do that. Same thing with riding a bicycle. We have to learn how to do that. No one inherently knows how to do that skill. But running is something that nobody ever taught us how to do. We just naturally know how to do it. We all did it as toddlers, running around the playground, around our parents' homes. But we're going to spend some time talking about things that you can do to make your running technique better so that you can run better and reduce the risk of injury. There's some research to show that certain things that you do when you run could increase the risk of a running-related injury, so we'll talk all about that. So if you're just joining us, welcome to another episode of RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. So let's first talk about the basics. Let's break this down into different parts. The most important part of running technique is where your foot lands when it lands on the ground. It should land directly or as close to directly underneath your hips. Everyone is going to run with their foot landing slightly out in front of their center of gravity. It's impossible to have your foot land directly underneath your hips. We're all going to land slightly out in front. So that's okay. But when you land way out in front, you end up creating a break. You have a very severe heel strike when your foot lands on the ground, and that decelerates your body. So you can think of your horizontal velocity. Every time you land on the ground, your horizontal velocity is going to come to zero because you're stopping your body and then restarting it in the next step. And so you want to minimize that deceleration. Hi, Christopher. It's good that people come in the room, so I'll try to say hello to people as they come in the room. So you want to minimize that deceleration on every single step. And when you land way out in front of you, you're doing the exact opposite. You're creating a break where you're decelerating a lot. And then that leg has to come through the stance phase. So you have a longer stance phase before your leg gets kicked to the back, and then you bring the leg through the front again. So you want to minimize that braking action. And the way you do that is by landing as close to directly underneath your hips as possible. So you reduce the amount of time that your leg is in contact with the ground, that your foot's in contact with the ground. And that is something that we see a lot in elite runners. If you measure what's called their ground contact time, the amount of time that the foot is in contact with the ground, very, very good runners spend less time on the ground. They spend more time in the air between steps. Their ground contact time is very, very short. People who are more recreational runners and slower runners and people who are landing directly, outside their center of gravity when they're landing in front of their body, they're spending more time on the ground. And so it's almost counterintuitive because the only way you can affect your horizontal velocity, your speed, is when the foot is in contact with the ground, because when you're in the air, there's nothing you can do about how fast you're running. So it's almost counterintuitive that you don't want to spend a lot of time on the ground, but you need to spend some time on the ground to produce force against the ground to project yourself forward. That's the only time you can affect your horizontal velocity. So it's almost a little counterintuitive there, because you got to be on the ground, but the trick is to be on the ground and produce as much force as quickly as possible, and we'll get into that in a second. So the most important part of running technique is getting your foot to land as close to underneath your center of gravity as possible. And that does a couple of things. Number one, like I said before, it reduces the ground contact time. It also reduces the load at which the ground is producing force against your foot. So every time you land on the ground, so here's a little bit of Isaac Newton from high school physics class. I said in my preview when I posted this earlier today that we're going to have a cameo appearance from Isaac Newton. So here's Isaac Newton's first cameo appearance. Every time you land on the ground, you produce force against the ground. And the ground, in response to that, produces force back up against your foot. And that's called the ground reaction force. And that's what we measure inside of a lab. We have people running over force plates or force platforms, and we measure the ground contact time, we measure the ground reaction force. And we can actually chart that on a graph and look at when different parts of the foot hit the force plates, we can actually measure what the ground reaction force is. And so every time you land on the ground, you produce force against the ground. And because of what we know from Isaac Newton, he had 3 laws of motion. His third law of motion, which we'll come back to many times over the next hour, is that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And the thing about force, again, we're going to go back to high school physics class. You learned about force. Force is a vector. And a vector has 2 parts to it. It has magnitude, how much, the amount of force, and it has direction, the direction at which that force is applied. And so when you land all the way out in front of you, when you're not directly landing underneath your hips, and you're landing out in front of you, you are applying force to the ground down and forward. And when you apply, you can visualize this. When I do this stuff in person, we actually do running technique drills, and you can see the whole thing. So you're going to have to do some visualization here, and I'll walk you through that. When you land out in front of you, it's as if you're putting on a brake, because you are producing force against the ground, down and forward. And so when you do that, which way do you think the ground is producing force against you, against your foot, against your body? That's correct, up and back. And so the ground is pushing you back, but you want to run forward. But with every step, when you land out in front of you, because for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, the ground is applying force to you up because you're pushing down. The ground is applying force up, and it's pushing you back. And so it's like you're working, the ground reaction force is working completely against you on every single step. It's directing force the opposite direction that you want to go. You want to run forward. And so that's one of the most important reasons why your foot should land directly underneath your hips, so that you produce force down and starting to produce force back, because right away after your leg touches down the ground, you're already going to be pushing back against the ground through the stance phase. And so you're producing force down and back, and so the ground is producing force up and forward against you, and that's why you get projected forward. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Thank you, Isaac Newton. Oh, you're welcome, Jason. Oh, see, he's here in the room with me. And so that's one of the reasons. As far as an injury prevention reason, when you land in front of you, way out in front of you, because you have more time that your foot is on the ground, that is more time for the ground reaction force to be applied to your leg and up the entire kinetic chain. And so it's more time, and we call that the loading time. The loading time is greater when your foot lands out in front of you. When your foot lands directly underneath you, almost as quickly as the foot lands, you're picking it up off the ground. And so the amount of time that the ground reaction force is applying that force to you is lessened. And so with every single step, you have a less total magnitude, or the amount of time that the force is applied to your body. And so from an injury prevention standpoint, that's why it's important to land directly underneath you, because there is research to show that the loading time at which the ground reaction force is applied has implications, especially for something like a stress fracture, because it's all about the loading to the bone with a stress fracture. The reason why people get that injury, it's all about a small amount of force applied repeatedly over the course of many, many runs. Every time you land on the ground, you're applying a small amount of force, and it's the repetition of that force. And so when the loading time is greater, then multiply that over how many steps you take on just every single run you take, and you can see why that would put a lot of stress on the bones. And so stress fracture is one of the injuries that may be caused by an increased loading time from the ground reaction force. And so the most important, I'll repeat what I said earlier, that the most important part of running technique for a variety of reasons, for performance, to project you forward, as well as for reducing the risk of injury, especially to bones and stress fractures, is to land directly underneath your hips, or as close to directly underneath your hips, your center of gravity, as possible. So that's the first step of that. So now how do you do that? Because it's one thing to say, okay, that's what you got to do. It's another thing entirely to be able to actually execute that. Because a lot of people, especially with a lot of shoes the way they're made these days, with a lot of padding in the heel, a lot of people will naturally strike with the heel way out in front of them. And I will say about heel striking that heel striking is not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of elite runners heel strike as well. It's just the placement of the foot directly underneath your hips is what's much more important than which part of the foot touches down first. Your heel should, when you're running slowly, the heel does touch down first, but it happens milliseconds before the midfoot. Whereas if you land with a severe heel strike, the only way you would land with a severe heel strike with your toes pointed in the air is if you're landing all the way out in front of you. If you're landing close to underneath your hips, then the heel strike happens literally milliseconds. I've measured this in the lab. Part of my doctoral dissertation was looking at the entrainment of the coordination of breathing with stride rate, and I measured their foot strike and what part of the foot landed down on the treadmill belt first. And so I was able to measure all this stuff, and it was quite fascinating to see that even good runners, they do strike down with the heel first, but it literally happens immediately before the rest of the foot. It's milliseconds before the rest of the foot. So it's okay to heel strike. You just don't want it to be such a severe heel strike where your foot is all the way out in front of your body and your toes are pointed up in the air. You don't want a heel strike like that. You want a heel strike that literally comes down milliseconds before the rest of the foot does. We can measure that in the lab. A lot of people measure that around the world. And so a lot of people are chiming in, so does RPM correlate with more air time? Well, yeah, it does. I mean, if you're spending, and we'll get into that about stride rate and stride length and which is more important, because you hear a lot of, generalities that are given. You hear a lot of, people comment on the 180 steps per minute and blah, blah, blah. And there's no one stride rate and there's no one stride length. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's do one thing at a time. So the most important thing is get your foot down underneath your center of gravity, or as close to underneath your center of gravity as possible. And so there's a lot of drills that you can do. If you don't naturally do this, there's a lot of drills that you can do that will cause you to have a quicker cadence or a quicker stride rate to be able to do that. Sometimes you could do some little barefoot drills in the grass, or just get used to that movement. And so that gets us into what we call the sweep. So you hear this a lot with sprint coaches about how they sweep their leg underneath them. They paw at the ground. Like if you have a cat or a dog, watch the way they run. Watch how they extend out their front two limbs, and then they grab the ground with their claws, just like the spikes on a track. They grab with their claws, and they literally are moving the bottom part of their leg. So from the knee to the ankle, we call that the shank of your leg. And that part of your leg, the lower part of your leg, should already be moving backwards relative to the ground as you land on the ground. So it's this pawing action. And the faster you run, the more aggressive that pawing action is against the ground. And so we can call that the sweep. That when your leg comes out, after you go through the swing phase, you're running along, and you go through the swing phase. I'm going to do this with my fingers because I can't do this showing the running technique live here. I'm not that crafty that I could do that. I have the running technique drills on the Facebook and Instagram Live. Maybe one day I'll get crafty, I'll do that. But if you're running along, after your foot lands and it goes through the swing phase, so the whole time your foot is in the air and comes back to the front, we call that the swing phase. You're swinging your leg to the front, and your leg is going to be somewhat extended in the front. But before that foot lands on the ground, you got to sweep or paw the ground. You got to sweep that leg back down so that it lands directly underneath you. And that's a very active motion, that sweeping motion. And we can practice that through the use of drills. You can lean up against a fence and go through that whole running leg motion and then work on sweeping that leg back. So it's hamstrings will bend the knee, so it's a lot of, the hamstrings are back here. And so it's, works your hamstrings a lot, and it works the hips, because the hip extensors. So we have hip flexion when we come to the front, and then we have hip extension as we go to the back. And so we can work on those things. If you don't naturally do it, there's a series of drills. My certification program has these drills. If you go on my YouTube channel at Dr. Jason Karp, you can have videos of a lot of these drills. And so we can work on drills where we work on that pawing action. We work on that sweeping action. Most of this stuff with running technique, it's all neuromuscular. It's all about how your brain communicates with your muscles to move your limbs the way you want them to be moved. It's just like the practicing of any skill. Like when you first learned to swim as a child, it was the same kind of thing. You had to learn how to swim. Your brain had to learn how to communicate with your arms to move in that direction. Or even when you were a toddler and you went from a crawl to a walk to a run, even though you didn't have to be taught how to do that, your brain was teaching your muscles how to do that. When you first got up to stand up to walk, it wasn't a smooth looking motion. You were not beautiful looking when you first started to walk and you started to run. It took time to coordinate those movements, to get the balance, to get the coordination. That's all neuromuscular. It's all about how your brain recruits the muscle fibers in the right order at the right time to be able to create this smooth movement. And it's the same with any type of skill. It's the same with swinging a golf club or swinging a tennis racket. It's absolutely the same. And so we do these drills to practice those movements, to ingrain those movements so that when you run, it becomes automatic and it's not something you have to think about. And so we call that the sweep. When you go through the swing phase and your leg comes back out to the front, you sweep that leg back so that by the time it touches the ground, it's directly underneath your body. And then you start pushing off the ground, extending the hip, and then you bend the knee and bring it back through to the front again. And that's all running is. It's land, push the ground behind you, bend the knee, and pull the knee through to the front. Land, push off, pull through. Land, push off, pull through. That's all you're doing. That's all running is. Landing on the ground, pushing the ground down and back behind you so that the ground reaction force pushes you up and forward, that projects you forward. And then you bend the knee to shorten this limb, because you don't want to bring your leg out when it's straight. You want a bent leg to bring out, because when you bend the leg, it shortens the limb and you can sweep it through quicker. You can get through that swing phase quicker. A great sport to study biomechanics is figure skating. If you ever watch figure skating, you see what these men and women do when they are spinning on the ice or jumping up in the air, spinning in the air. They always tighten themselves. They shorten their levers to make themselves tight so that they spin quicker. And it's the same concept when you pick your leg up after you push down against the ground and you pick the leg up to bring it through. You bend the knee to shorten that lever, because a shortened lever can swing through faster. You can increase angular momentum. I told you we're going to go all the way back to high school. If you were not paying attention in high school physics class, if you were sleeping in the back of the classroom, well, now it's all coming back, okay? We all learned this in high school physics class about angular momentum and how shortening a lever increases the angular momentum. We learned all about this. If you didn't take physics till college, then we'll go back to college physics class, one or the other, high school or college. I took AP physics when I was at high school. And you remember the AP exams? I did so poorly. That was the worst AP exam I had. And so I had to retake. I didn't pass it. It was on a scale of 1 to 5. And you had to get either a 3, 4, or 5 on the AP physics exam. I'll never forget this. You had to get a 3, 4, or 5 on the AP physics exam to be waived in college taking physics to get the credits for it. And I got a 2. I got a 2 on the AP physics exam in high school. And so I had to retake physics in college. So I had to sit through it all over again because I didn't get a high enough score on the AP physics exam in high school. It was one of the hardest exams I've ever taken. But now all these years later, it's funny how I talk about it all the time, because with me, I always have to relate things to its application. And so these concepts are not difficult to understand if you relate it to it, if you apply it in some way. So with me, I apply it to running, and it all makes sense. So hopefully it makes sense to you. So that's the running form in a nutshell. Do certain drills to practice that sweep so that you can land directly underneath your center of gravity, and then work on getting your leg down and push it off the ground as quickly as possible. Because the trick to running faster, this is what you came for, so listen closely. The trick to running faster is to apply as much force to the ground as you can as quickly as possible. You want to spend a little time on the ground, but during that short amount of time, it's a fraction of a second, you're not on the ground. Even when you're running slowly, each foot is on the ground for less than 1 second, you want to apply as much force as possible, as quickly as possible. So it's the rate of force development that matters. And if you multiply force times time, that's called impulse. And so there's another physics concept, is the impulse. You want to have really good impulse and a quick rate of force development. And we can practice that. One of the things that we can do is plyometric training, because that's what plyometrics get. You do a bunch of hops and skips and bounding, and that's what it practices, producing a lot of force against the ground as quickly as you possibly can. And so that's running technique in a nutshell. It's all about the angles at which you move your limbs and being able to apply force in the direction that you want to apply force. So it's amazing to me, all this commotion that goes on about running technique. When you break it down, it actually is pretty simple. It's all about producing as much force to the ground as quickly as possible and applying it in the direction at which you want it to be applied, so that the ground reaction force projects you forward with every step. And so that gets us into stride rate and stride length. People always get this question wrong when I answer it. What do you think is the most important variable? If you take speed equals stride rate times stride length. The stride rate, how many times per minute you are moving your feet, how many steps per minute you take, times the distance that you cover with every step, the stride length. Which do you think is the most important influencer of the speed? Do you think it's stride rate, or do you think it's stride length? Let's take a moment and take a vote. Who thinks it's stride length? Who thinks it's stride rate? Oh, I see all the hands coming up. I see no hands. I'm talking to myself on through the phone and the computer. But I'm assuming that you're all putting your hands up. You have to vote for one or the other. Stride rate or stride length. Most people, when I ask this question, when I teach the certification course, I always ask this question, and most people get this question wrong. It is, if you said stride rate, you are wrong. Stride length is the bigger influencer on how fast you run. But stride length does not come from reaching out in front of you. We already covered that. Stride length comes from Issac Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if you want to be projected forward more with every step, what do you have to do? That's right. You have to apply more force to the ground, down and back, so that the ground projects you forward. The ground reaction force, the direction, is projecting you forward with every step. And so that's why hip extension, getting that hip back, and so that you have a straight leg in the back. It's hard to see. I know it's hard to see me doing my little fingers here. But you want to extend the hip all the way back so that your leg is straight. If you see pictures of really good runners in mid-flight, it's the most beautiful picture to see, where that back leg is all the way back, then they don't bring their leg forward until they have full hip extension with a straight leg in the back. Then they bend the knee and bring the leg through the front again. Look at pictures online of really good runners when they're in mid-flight. Very beautiful to watch. Right after they push off the ground, and how far back that leg is extended behind them. You can see how much distance they're going to cover with every step. And so stride length is actually more important. If you don't believe me, do a little experiment. Next time you go out for a run, do this on flat ground, because if you go up or down a hill, that's going to affect the stride rate and stride length. So do this on flat ground. Next time you go out for a run, whatever slow speed you're running at, just on a very easy slow run, for 1 minute, count how many times your right leg touches down the ground. Count how many steps you take, just one leg at a time. Count how many steps you take in that 1 minute. And then remember that. Then pick up the speed to something faster. And again, for 1 minute, count how many steps you take. And what you'll notice is if you'll only take a few extra steps in that minute, that it's not going to be a difference of 20 steps or 30 steps over the course of that minute. You're only going to take a few extra steps. Some people may not take any extra steps. It may be the exact same number. But it's never going to be a lot more. You're only going to take a few extra steps in that minute. The bigger difference that's causing you to run faster is that when you run, without even thinking about this is the way we naturally move. We produce more force against the ground, so that the ground produces more force against our foot. And so that's what naturally happens. If you want to run faster, how do you do that? By producing more force against the ground and extending the stride length. And so the stride length actually exerts a greater influence on speed than the stride rate does. And we see this in other sports too. You look at rowers, you look at swimmers, which is more important? To take more strokes per minute or to increase the distance of each stroke? Whether you're in a rowboat or you're swimming in a pool, it's the same concept. It's the distance per stroke that matters more than how many strokes you take per minute. And it's the same thing with running. It's the distance per step that matters more. The question is why? We're not sure why, but this gets into some of the research that I did for my dissertation. This is one of the things I looked at. I was looking at economy and the coordination of breathing and stride rates, and there's been a lot of research done. Well-known biomechanist Peter Cavanaugh did this kind of research in the 1980s, looking at stride rate and stride length, and it's not been proven yet scientifically, but it seems that the reason we do it that way, the reason why our strategy is to increase the stride length, is that it's to maximize economy. That human beings, our body is always trying to do what is most economical. And economy literally means the cost, the energy cost of running, how much oxygen you consume to maintain a given speed. The faster we run, we consume more oxygen to maintain that speed. And we're always trying to consume as little oxygen as possible, make it less costly to maintain a given speed. And it seems to be a more economical strategy for us to increase our distance per step than to have the legs go through a whole another running leg cycle. That there's a lot of muscular activity to put the leg down, to sweep it in the back, to bring it back through to the front. There's a lot of muscle activity going on there. And to do that muscle activity costs a lot of oxygen. It's more costly to do that. That's also why running is a great way to lose weight, because your body wants to do what's most economical. And when you weigh less, especially when your leg weighs less, it costs less oxygen to pick the leg up and put it down, and pick the leg up and put it down, and pick the leg up and put it down. And that's why you see really good runners have very thin legs. It looks like my finger. They have the Kenyans, the Ethiopians, very thin legs, not a lot of muscle mass. And that helps it with economy. And so our body is always trying to do what is most economical. And it turns out, this goes back to the 1980s and Peter Cavanaugh's research, that there may be a most economical range of stride rates to work in, to run in. And so the strategy that our bodies take on is to increase the stride length to increase the speed, not so much to increase the stride rate. Stride rate and stride length both increase with an increase in speed, but stride length, the distance per step, increases a lot more than does the stride rate. So go out and do that experiment. Next time you're on flat ground, try it. Count the number of steps, and then run faster. Count the number of steps again. See, how many steps you were taking, how many extra steps you took in that minute when you were running faster compared to you were running slow. We do this experiment all the time when I'm allowed to teach live courses at gyms around the country and around the world. We do this as part of the live certification course. I have somebody go on a treadmill, and we have other people count the number of steps, and then we change the speeds. We have the person run at different speeds, and we count the number of steps. And people are always amazed to find out that the number of steps only changes a little bit. Sometimes it doesn't change at all. That is the stride length that's making the bigger difference in terms of speed. And so let's get back to a comment that one person made about the stride rate. And so we see this a lot in the popular literature, in social media and Runner's World magazine and things like that. They always talk about the number 180. And so it turns out that most good runners fluctuate somewhere around 180 steps per minute, but it doesn't have to be exact. So most people, when you're a good runner and you're landing directly underneath your hips, most good runners will take somewhere between 80 and 90 steps per minute with each leg. So if you multiply that, that's 160 to 180 steps per minute. And so there seems to be a narrow range that human beings work in, that run in, that seems to be what's most economical. And so if you count the steps and you're only at 150 steps per minute, that probably tells you that you're landing directly out in front of you, yet you're not underneath your hips, that you're too far out in front when you land, and you need to quicken the steps to get the foot directly underneath you. So you can work again on drills that can help you increase your stride rate. Some people will attach some kind of metronome to, if they're wearing a hat when they run, they'll attach a metronome to the back of their hat or to their clothes, and you can go in concert with the metronome. That's one way to try to ingrain it. And there are other drills. Running slightly downhill. If you go like on a downhill stretch of grass, then you can do sprints downhill. That helps you to move the legs faster. And so there's a lot of drills that you can do to try to quicken the steps. You can do some barefoot drills in the grass that force you to land more on the midfoot rather than strike hard with the heel, because when you run barefoot with your heel, it hurts, and so you tend not to do that. And so there's little drills, quick step drills that you can do to try to quicken the steps to work on getting your foot directly underneath your hips when you're running. So there's lots of drills. It's the same thing with any technical skill. You do a lot of drill work to ingrain the movements, and then you take those movements and apply it to real running. And so it's a step process. You don't just go out and try to do it the right way from the beginning. You have to, train the movements first. It's piecemeal. That's how you put, skills together. It's parts to the whole. You do the whole, and you break it down into parts, and then you come back to the whole again. It's whole part whole method. For those of you who study skill acquisition and motor control and motor learning, it's the whole part whole method. Look that stuff up. And there's a whole area of research on skill acquisition and learning how to develop new skills. And so you can get into that with these running drills. There's lots of different drills that you can do. And again, if you want to check out, I have a few of them on my YouTube channel that are part of the certification course. So go on YouTube, check out my running technique drills to practice how to do some of these things. And so let's see, this is probably a good time to get to some questions here. See what kind of questions other people have. Juan is in the room. Hi, Juan. How's it going? We can get into some questions. I don't know if people have questions. Bill. Hey, Bill. It's good to see Bill again. He says, very good information. Combined with sprint drills, students can train and improve running. Yeah, exactly. I mean, distance runners, a lot of recreational distance runners, they shy away from sprinting. But doing sprinting and doing the specific sprint drills that sprinters normally do, that can really help distance runners. The distance runners tend to get lazy with their technique because they go out and they slog through a lot of slow miles. And if you just do a lot of slow miles, it's great, but you become a slow runner and your technique needs to be cleaned up. And so sprint drills are really valuable for distance runners, even though they're not sprinters. It can be very valuable. So distance runners shouldn't shy away from doing sprint drills because it can really help clean up the technique and get that pawing action that we talked about before, get that pawing action and that sweeping action to get the foot to land directly underneath your hips. Very important. You still want to be sharp, even as a distance runner. You still want to have sharp, smooth technique, not that slogging, slow technique. You still have to have good, sharp technique, even as a distance runner, and get that pop off the ground. And that only comes through practice, unless you started running as a kid and you've been running for a long time, because we do this stuff as kids a lot, sprinting in the playground and everything. But if you're an adult and you're starting to run as an adult, a lot of people just do the long, slow stuff. They want to run a marathon, so everything they do is long and slow, and they don't get that pop off the ground. And that needs to be practiced. You got to develop that technique. I mean, it's all neural. It's all how your brain communicates with your motor units, your muscle fibers, to recruit them quickly, to apply force to the ground. And plyometrics can help with that. And even some of the drills that sprinters and hurdlers do can be very valuable for a distance runner. So don't shy away from that stuff. And I'm happy to help. I mean, you guys can email me. You can message me on Instagram or Facebook. I'm happy to help. And hopefully more and more people will tune in. We have a lot of people tuning in, but not too many questions yet. So feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to ask questions. So that's running technique in a nutshell. It is really teaching your muscles how to move, how to coordinate those movements with a series of drills, and getting your foot to land directly underneath you. And like I said, I mean, there's a lot of this goes back to Isaac Newton had 3 laws of motion. We've only spoken about the last one, the 3rd law of motion, but the other 2 apply also. There's the second. Let's go backwards since we started with the 3rd law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. The 2nd law of motion is force equals mass times acceleration. And that's I don't know if he discovered that. I don't know if it's true with the apple falling down on his head, if that's how he discovered that law. But force equals mass times acceleration. And when we run, acceleration is due to gravity, but we also have angular acceleration of the limbs. And so the greater the mass, this is why as a runner you want to have limbs, you want to have legs that don't have a lot of muscle mass. Because the more muscle mass that you have, the harder it's going to be to accelerate that muscle mass through the running leg motion. And that's why sprinting is very different than distance. When sprinters, it's all about power production. If you want a powerful muscle, it has to be strong and it has to be fast. One way to make a muscle stronger is to make it larger, hypertrophy of the muscle, it leads to greater strength. But for a distance runner, it's all about economy. It's all about reducing the amount of oxygen to maintain a given speed, reducing the oxygen cost. Just like in a car, you want to use as little gasoline as possible to drive at a given speed. The less gasoline you use, the more economical your car. Same concept. The less oxygen you use to maintain a given speed, the more economical you are, and the faster you're going to be able to run at any amount of oxygen use. And so you don't want to have a lot of muscle mass, because if you've been listening for the last 15, 20 minutes, half hour, however long we've been on here, then the astute listener would say, well, gee, if I want to produce more force against the ground, why not just get bigger muscles? Then I can produce more force against the ground. And I would say, you're right. You want to get bigger muscles to produce more force against the ground if you are a sprinter. Because if you are a distance runner, having extra mass on your legs, especially from the knee down, if you have big calves, if you have big quads, big hamstrings, if you've got big thighs and you've got big calves, especially the lower leg, if you've got big calves, yes, you'll produce more force against the ground, but you're going to reduce economy. And so you're going to end up having a greater negative impact on your running performance than the positive impact of being able to produce more force against the ground, because you're just going to use more oxygen to move the leg through the whole running leg cycle. And so you don't want to add muscle mass to your legs, even though that would produce more force against the ground and project you more forward with every step. Sprinters cover a lot of ground with every step. I mean, if you look at the data on sprinters and how many steps they take to cover a 100-meter race, they don't take a lot of steps. I think Usain Bolt took like mid-40. I think he was like 45, 46 steps for the entire freaking race. It's unbelievable. How do you cover 100 meters just taking 40-something steps? It's because he's covering an enormous amount of distance with every single step, because he's striking the ground so hard, so powerful, that the ground reaction force is projecting him forward. It's like he's flying across the track. It's projecting him forward with every single step. But as a distance runner, you have to always understand the importance of running economy and reducing the amount of oxygen to maintain a given speed. And so you don't want to increase muscle mass as a distance runner because of that negative impact on economy. And so the way we increase speed with distance running, the way we increase force production against the ground, is through increasing the rate of force development through the plyometric activities and sweeping the leg and working on the angular velocities and moving the leg through that running leg motion as quickly as we possibly can. Okay, let's get to some other questions while we have on here. Let's see, what do we got here? Maximizing, yeah, you're right, Bill. Maximize it one, and that's the trick. If you maximize the stride length, you can't minimize the stride rate. And that's why it's a fairly tricky combination of two. What Peter Cavanaugh's research showed in the 80s and ever since then is that humans tend to do what is most economical. We tend to adopt the most economical strategy. And so for each person, we have the right combination of stride rate and stride length. And so the trick to training is you want to be able to produce more force against the ground and increase your stride length without sacrificing the stride rate. You don't want the stride rate to get slower, to get smaller, because speed equals stride rate times stride length. So if you increase one, by definition, if you increase one, the other one is going to come down. And so you can't do that, because then the speed's not going to change. You have to be able to increase the stride rate without increase the stride length without sacrificing the stride rate. And that takes years to be able to do that, because you don't want to get a longer step and then get small and get a slower turnover, slower stride rate, because then that's not going to change the speed at all. So in order to get faster, you have to be able to cover more ground with every step without reducing the stride rate. So again, it's skill acquisition. It's being able to develop that, and that takes months to years to develop that. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So very good. I'm glad you brought up that point, because you don't want to just increase one to sacrifice the other. That's not going to help your speed. And there's a lot of research that has taken runners and they manipulate what their stride rate and stride length is. And what have they shown? That the preferred stride rate, stride length combination is what's most economical. Humans do what's most economical. And so as far as training, you have to train yourself to produce more force against the ground and have a longer stride length, but still maximize economy. Not only not sacrifice the stride rate by doing that, but the economy has to be there. You can't become more economical. You can't just go out and start running with longer strides, because all that's going to do is make you less economical. You have to train yourself to be more economical at a longer stride length. And that, again, that takes time. That takes months to years to develop that. Okay, so let's get into some more questions here. Do long-legged runners have an advantage? Very good question. A lot of people think, well, stride length is due to how long your legs are. Well, what do you know? That's another myth. If you look at the best runners in the world, this also goes back to a lot of Peter Cavanaugh's research on running mechanics. I urge you to look up Peter Cavanaugh. He's one of the most well-known biomechanists in the world. I was very lucky to rub elbows with him at Penn State. Speaking about Penn State, Bill Whitaker. Peter Cavanaugh used to work, he used to be the director of what was called CELOS, Center for Locomotion Studies at Penn State. It used to be in the old intramural building. The intramural sports building is where his Center for Locomotion Studies used to be. I think it might still be there. Peter Cavanaugh is no longer at Penn State. He's moved on. He's been in a different place. I think he's at the Cleveland Clinic now. He's at the tail end of his career. But I think now he's at the Cleveland Clinic. But go back to Peter Cavanaugh's research in the 1980s. He did a lot of this research on stride rate, stride length in very elite distance runners. And a lot of what we know about this comes from the early days of his research in the 1980s. But look at the best distance runners in the world. They're quite small people with slim legs and slim arms. And you would think, if that were true, if people with longer legs, taller people, had longer stride lengths, then you would expect people well over 6 feet tall would be the best distance runners. And that's totally untrue. The best distance runners are very small people. The women, the men, they're very small people. They don't have very long legs. They're not over 6 feet tall. The stride length comes from the production of force against, again, we go back to high school physics and Isaac Newton. The production of force against the ground is what gives you the longer stride length. The more force production against the ground, it has nothing to do. There's actually a very low correlation between somebody's height or their leg length and their stride length. It all comes down to how much force you're producing at the ball of the foot when you land on the ground. That's what dictates the stride length. That has little to do with how tall the person is or how long their legs are. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another myth. People think that, well, I can't run fast because I got short legs. Well, it has nothing to do with whether you have short legs or long legs. It has to do with how much force you're producing against the ground. You look at the best male and female runners in the world. They're tiny people. They're below average height and weight, and so they don't have the legs of a basketball player, and they're still able to run a heck of a lot faster than a basketball player, because it's all about how much force you can produce against the ground and how quickly you can produce that force against the ground to project you forward. So again, I always urge people, I don't want you to believe me even though I'm right. I mean, this is my TV show, so I know I'm right. I mean, I've been reading this research for a long time, and I have been, in the lab for a long time, and I've measured it myself. And I saw, even during my dissertation work, I saw that when we changed speeds, that people were not taking more steps. What was increasing was their stride length. And they're not thinking about this. They're not trying to do it that way. It's just what humans naturally do. And again, do an experiment on yourself. Go outside, run, and you change the speed. And you'll see that you're only going to take a few more steps in the course of that minute when you increase the speed. That what's making the difference is the stride length. That's the way we're designed. That's the most economical strategy. And so that's what we do, even without thinking about it. Ben says, what about midgets? Are they a disadvantage? Well, they're probably at a mechanical disadvantage, yes. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the research on midgets running. But, they would be probably at a mechanical disadvantage. But not because of their stride length or stride rate. But they probably, I can't speak to, I don't know the mechanics of midgets compared to non-midgets. But that would be an interesting area of research, actually, to read. If it hasn't already been done, then to do it yourself. Ben's asking a lot of questions. I see a lot of questions, Ben. That's good. It's good to be curious. So I don't know if anybody else has any questions. All the live shows every week are recorded, and so they'll be posted. So if you have a question, then feel free to ask. Let's see, sprinters' legs seem to be in front of them. Yeah, okay, so great question. So if you slow motion the videotape of sprinters, you watch what they do. When they land, they're landing directly, their foot is coming down to the track directly underneath them. But yes, they're very aggressive, and it looks like their leg is out in front of them. But they have this incredible sweeping motion that if you take video of a sprinter, look at videos of Usain Bolt, go on YouTube, look at videos of Usain Bolt, and then slow it down. Look at him run in slow motion, that the foot comes down. When it's coming down to the track, it's coming down very close to underneath his hips, so that he can apply a very aggressive force down to the track. So yeah, when you watch it in real time, it looks like their legs are coming out way out in front of them because they have this huge rotation of their hips and the legs coming down, sweeping down. But when they come down back to the track, their leg is coming down directly underneath them. So the shank of their leg, from their knee to their ankle, the shank of their leg is pawing at the track. So it's moving backwards relative to the ground by the time the foot lands on the ground. It's very aggressive. It's very interesting to watch. So I urge you to watch slow motion video of world-class sprinters and watch what their foot does before it lands on the track. Bill says if both tall and short runners could maximize both stride length and frequency, a tall runner could have an advantage. Theoretically, that would be true, but it comes back to economy, that tall runners they're not going to be as economical as shorter runners. Runners will always their body always wants to do what's most economical, and economy is like the governor of running. We do what is most economical, and we're always striving to become more economical. And so when you run a race, you have to be, the body wants to use as little oxygen as possible, and that's the person who's going to win is going to be the one who is much more economical than the other. And so tall runners, they're typically bigger people, they weigh more. There have been some tall runners who are rail thin. Like if you look at one of the ones that comes to mind is Alan Culpepper. Alan Culpepper was at least 6 feet tall, if not taller, but he was like 130 pounds. He was rail thin. And so if you're going to be a tall runner, you have to be rail thin because of the reason of economy. Taller runners are typically less economical because they weigh more. And so you want to weigh as little as possible to be a good distance runner. And that's why good distance runners tend to be on the short side. They tend to be slightly below average height. Most of the best male runners are around 5'7", 5'8", 5'9". Females are 5'2", 5'3", 5'4". They're under the average height, but not by much. I mean, they're not 5 feet tall, although some women have been very, very small over the years who have been really good runners. But that would be the trade-off with the taller runners, is that they typically weigh more, and so they're going to be less economical than a shorter runner. And so, yeah, Ben, you're right. Yeah, you don't see 6 foot tall people winning, and that's the reason why, because it's hard to be 120 pounds and be 6 feet tall, and so that's why the taller runners, it's not really from the mechanical. It could be from the mechanical for a little bit, because when you sweep your leg back, again, you got to bend your knee to bring it through to the front again to shorten that lever to maximize the angular velocity. And in a taller runner, it's going to be harder to do that because the lever is going to be longer. So while maybe they can get greater hip extension and apply force to the ground in a way that enables them to get projected forward, then their angular velocity, their ability to bring that leg back up to the front, is going to be slowed down because there's just more mass there. There's more of a leg there that they have to bring back to the front again, and that's difficult to do. And so from that mechanical reason, it hurts really tall runners. Bill, depends on the length of course. Yeah, it depends on the length of the race. Yeah, the longer the race, the more important the economy is, and so the more important it is to be smaller. And that's why sprinters tend to be taller, because they don't have to worry so much about bringing the leg back. For them, it's all about power production, and so sprinters tend to be taller, bigger people, with longer limbs that can apply a lot of force to the ground for a longer time when they extend their leg back, and there's different considerations. But yes, I agree that the shorter the race, you can get away with being taller, and most sprinters are pretty tall. It's very rare to find a sprinter who is as short as a good distance runner. to find a really world-class sprinter who's under 6 feet tall for men, under 5'7" for women, it's rare. It's been known to happen. There are some people. I remember some people. Andre Kaysen was 5'7". He was a world-class sprinter. Laura Williams, another world-class sprinter. Olympic gold medalist. She was quite short for a sprinter, but it's rare. It's there are always exceptions to the rule, but it's not the rule. Sprinters typically tend to be much taller, and distance runners tend to be smaller than average, for both physiological reasons and oxygen consumption, as well as for the mechanical reasons. Okay, we're getting closer to the end, and so I know Instagram cuts us off for an hour. So if you're just joining us, well, you missed a lot, but it's all recorded, so you can watch the video. So, again, go on my YouTube channel. I have some running technique drills that you can watch if you're interested in learning some drills, and of course my certification course is an entire manual on running technique, and we delve deeper into these concepts. So every week I end with a thought. My thoughts are kind of a lot of them are the same these days, because we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's no place to go, and you run outside every day and trying to release tension. But my thought today comes back to the research on running and it's as a cure for depression. There's a lot of research to show that running is good for people who have depression, that it's just as, if not better than, psychotic drugs. People are given drugs to raise serotonin and manipulate the ratio between serotonin and dopamine. There's lots of drugs on the market that people are given for that. And the research shows that running, aerobic exercise in general, and running in particular, is just as, if not more effective than drugs for ameliorating symptoms of depression. And part of the reason gets to the runner's high. And a lot of people think it's because of endorphins, but it's not because of endorphins. The research shows that it's actually because of opioids and cannabinoids. So there you go. So running produces opioids, it releases opioids and cannabinoids in the brain, and that gives runners this euphoric feeling, this runner's high that we always talk about. And so before you run to your psychiatrist to get, if you happen to be depressed during this time, I know a lot of people are depressed during this time, but before you run to a psychiatrist to get a prescription for a drug, first try to use your running as a way to decrease the symptoms of depression. Run in different places, run at different times of the day, run with different people. If you can run with people who don't have the virus and you're safe to do it that way. But running can be a great antidote for depression, and it's a great way to stimulate this euphoric feeling. I find that when I run, that some of my most creative moments come in the moments after I run. I can't wait to sit in front of my computer and work on what the book that I'm working on another book right now. And I always find that the thoughts flow when I run, and then I can't wait to get in front of my computer afterward to start typing out what I was thinking about when I was running. And so use your running to ameliorate symptoms of depression. Come back next Monday. We will meet next Monday for another episode of Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. Be safe, be well. See you next week. Bye for now.